I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Rain and Ian. I really enjoyed talking to them and where the future of music and cannabis can go. A big thank you to Kristen McLeod for sharing her insights with us as well. Fascinating stuff. Coming up next is a real passion of mine. It's our third panel of the day, International Cannabis Council, what's happening globally. Really looking forward to this, and it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jackie King, Executive Director of the International Business at IBEC, and the former alumni of the Canadian Chamber and a partner in ours who actually helped take us to the OECD and the International Chamber of Commerce. So we're really excited to have her back here today joining this incredible panel. So thank you very much. And Jackie, over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. It's really great to be back and a real honor to be moderating this panel discussion. And hello from Brussels, everyone. So this session is bringing together more industry experts to highlight the developments of what's going on in the cannabis sector internationally. Certainly as the second country in the world to formally legalize the cultivation, possession, acquisition, and recreation of adult use cannabis. Canada's become an example to the world for our legalization framework and appropriate taxation and so on. So as the Canadian cannabis sector continues to grow, it can share and learn valuable insights from and learn from other jurisdictions, and there's certainly a leadership role there to play. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our panelists today. We have Michael Bronstein, co-founder and president of the American Association of Cannabis and Hemp; Christian Roswell, commercial sales manager in Canada for the Hawthorne Gardening Company, which is a subsidiary of the Scott's Miracle Grow Company; and Yasmin Shaker, head of regulatory and associate general counsel for North America for Cleverleaf. So welcome to you all. So I'll kick off with a number of questions, and then we'll open it up to audience questions a little later. So Michael, let's start with you to talk, south of the border, and there's an opportunity to move towards federal legalization of cannabis. What could that look like given the current political landscape, and what impact and opportunity will the U.S. market present to the international markets?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. And I thank the chamber here for engaging in this important discussion in highlighting the opportunity of both the international markets, but also trade in general, which is something that we need to spend more time, I think, talking about and the impacts internationally. From a United States perspective, what I could say is that over the last several years, there's been more of a look towards what the industry might look like from an international perspective. Certainly a post-federal legalization and what that might look like. And what I would say to you, we have a situation in the States now where, if people are less familiar with the U.S. market, states have legalized. So individual states have legalized. It is unlawful right now for a state operator to send product into another state on the cannabis side of the equation, and that has to do with complexities in United States federalism and the role between the state governments and the federal government. So there is a red line in the United States where cannabis right now is federally illegal. And I like to say that the next big piece of cannabis legislation that's passed at the federal level will be the first big piece of cannabis legislation that's passed at the federal level in the United States. The outlook generally, there's been some headwinds in Congress over the last several months, not just really on cannabis legislation, but prior to the infrastructure bill, on all legislative fronts. Democrats hold a narrow majority in both chambers, and as many of you have read, around the negotiations on the infrastructure bill and several other bills, it's been hard to keep majority opinion, and the Republicans have been keeping rank as minority party in both chambers. So it's been very hard from a legislative perspective to see movement in legislation in general. And I would also say that cannabis, to give a little bit of perspective here, the administration, the Biden administration, has not necessarily been completely prioritizing cannabis legislation, to say it politely. And from a congressional perspective, we have leadership in the Senate, Senator Booker Schumer Wyden, who have introduced a draft discussion bill that they've taken comments on, and we're anticipating that be reintroduced in the not so distant future. And what leadership is saying in the Senate is that they'll push that they'll push for a vote on this, which would be a very welcome opportunity. There's other legislation, the MORE Act, which has passed the House a few times, as well as other provisions that deal with banking that are currently out of the House and in front of the Senate. But I think that if you were to talk to people dollars to donuts, that cannabis legalization still remains quite a slog to be able to get to the finish line, and political forces are mounting in the United States, such as ourselves and other groups, trying to make that push. But there are definitely headwinds that have to do more with the externalities of politics than maybe they do with the specific policy. And from an international trade perspective, that's created both a lot of opportunity for positioning in the market prior to federal legalization, which we've seen companies in Canada do in terms of partnerships, but it's also created some uncertainty with what might happen going forward. And I would say to you, there's nobody that anticipates that the United States will not legalize federally at some point. The $24 billion question, I suppose, is when, and that's something that we can prognosticate a little bit more on this panel. But I just want to, from the United States perspective, we're still very much kind of held back on an international conversation on the domestic policy side, which we hope will be more favorable going forward.
Yeah, and certainly, international means Canada. Christian, when we were in the green room earlier, Christian asked a really good question to Yasmin about trade and exports and a cross border between Canadian cannabis companies and the U.S. So maybe, Christian, why don't you ask the question that you asked Yasmin, and Yasmin, if you wouldn't mind repeating your response to him, I think others would want to know as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, the question I was considering and wondering, if given the climate that we're in, if there's potential opportunity for cross branding or down the line in international trade, with different products or whatever, and if that's a great opportunity to look at.
Well, I mean, it's a very large subject and a good question. I mean, I think just generally, obviously international trade in medical cannabis, and I say medical cannabis because we actually can't, if we're going to be compliant with our international drug treaties, you can only trade in medical and scientific cannabis. So I want to put that out there. We can't trade recreational cannabis at this point in time. I will also add one other caveat before I answer your question. The word medical is an interesting word. I don't think it's not defined in these drug treaties. And so I think it's sort of open to see how that word becomes interpreted as years go by and more countries legalize recreationally, because, does medical cover non-pharma drugs, for example? I mean, the medical market is massive in Canada, but it's not clear where the line is with medical if you're not talking pharma. So there's this big space in the middle between rec and pharma drugs that could be considered medical and possibly would fall under the international trade requirement for it to be medical, but it's unclear yet. So I think that's an open question that'll be interesting and have a huge impact on international trade going down the road. As far as your question specifically, though, I mean, yes, there's huge opportunities. It depends, though, of course, on a country's willingness to let in imports and to allow exports. And different countries have different takes on this so far. We were talking prior to being live. You know, some countries, for example, in Canada, don't actually allow imports in right now of medical cannabis, but they are allowing exports. So in that kind of scenario, you know, Canada can export to countries that have legalized and, you know, potentially do great business there. But, you know, other companies who want to export to Canada don't have that ability, or import into Canada don't have the ability. So in that case, they're going to have to look at other options like partnerships, buying a company in Canada, and working within the regulatory and legal framework that the government of Canada has established right now. So it's not as easy right now to do business in Canada if you're coming from somewhere else, unless you actually actively purchase an entity in Canada or develop partnerships, but it is possible.
Yeah, to elaborate, yeah, that's kind of where I was going with that question, is not just, I guess, physical product, but also opportunities for established American brands. As an example, there's a lot of Canadian dollars kind of flowing south through the markets and whatnot. You see a lot of big Canadian companies that are established with the, let's just say, the bones of the industry, the regulatory framework. Is there opportunities to now take some of those brands that are being built up in the States, and even if not adopt the physical product, at least bring some of those brands to Canada and, you know, have some cross kind of promotion and interaction there?
Absolutely. You could have a, you know, you could bring the brand over and manufacture it in Canada and sell it in Canada. There's no reason why a company couldn't do that.
One of the things that I've seen also is there's been a lot of licensing deals of intellectual property in terms of how to produce products that are going cross market and looking at brand opportunities. You know, in earnest, and I think we've seen the same thing in Canada and also internationally, brands are growing an audience right now still, and we're literally just moving to the segment of the industry where we're becoming a branded industry. And I think that advertising regulations and some of the other things that we would normally traditionally associate with brand development need to either be understood across jurisdictions, both locally and internationally, to be able to build those brands. And then really kind of, you know, really kind of building the standards for the marketplace around it. I mean, we talk about international trade, and you know, one of the things that we're going to need to deal with that we've been working on, and I know that the Canadian market and several other companies or countries rather have been working on are developing international standards, whether it be through, you know, trade focused organizations or something like ASTM International, which you know, I know has had a lot of Canadian international involvement. We've been involved in some of those standards development for when we think markets will liberalize, and when there will be sort of potentials for both cross-border branding and cross-border trade, which we think is an eventuality going far into, you know, going much further into the future. One of these things that we also should, I think I'd be remiss to talk about on an international panel as it relates to brand building and some of these deals that have been going on, are also access to financial markets and capital raises that are going on both throughout the industry and across border. We attach as a capital markets council, where we've been very focused on being able to U.S. exchange and trades. And one of the things that we have noticed is that we've had to, you know, the U.S. markets have to protect, and I know that some of the brands that are on these markets, you know, have to be protected for how their involvement is in the U.S. market in order to maintain their listing. At least that's a concern. And I think one of the things that broadly U.S. capital market involvement would also mean international capital market involvement, just because of how important the U.S. capital markets are here. And I think that a lot of people have done Canadian deals also to be able to expand their own capital base potentially, which poses some of its some broader challenges for brands and how things are built. But you know, I think that the capital markets question on international trade is probably, we would put as top of the list relative to both how US brands are being built, but also how other brands will be built, both through Canada, the European markets, and even across Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent point, and that will certainly have an significant impact on the growth internationally. You know, we talked a little bit about the US and Canada, but last June, as you know, Yasmin, the Mexico Supreme Court ruled that the government should legalize recreational use of cannabis in that country. So what does that mean? You know, both, you know, if that happens, what are the implications, if any, that it could have on the USMCA if all three parties were to legalize cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So again, I should say off the top that the rec market legalization isn't in a very strict interpretation, quote, relevant for international trade, because we are only allowed to trade medical cannabis for now. Having said that, if you have medical cannabis legal in Mexico, and maybe even potentially down the line in the US, that's a really interesting proposition for the USMCA. So a few things could happen. I mean, actually, first I should say, I was actually involved with the negotiations for the USMCA, and I remember this being discussed. And the one thing I will say, which is kind of amusing now, is that I remember the sort of sense around the table was, the US and Mexico will never legalize. Why are we even thinking about this? And so that just shows you how quickly things can change. That wasn't that long ago. So, you know, for people who are doubting there's progress, there is progress. I mean, that's a huge change from just a short few years ago. It doesn't appear in the text, the word cannabis. Interestingly, it does appear in Mexico's schedules. And I'm not sure why that actually happened, because at the time, they were not trading internationally. It's not in Canada's, it's not in the US's, but there's nothing preventing the USMCA from encompassing medical cannabis. You know, it will be traded just like any other product under the Trading Goods Chapter. There may be some discussion amongst the three countries at the commission at the highest level, because it's an interesting product. Maybe they'll want to touch base about it, but I don't think legally there's any requirement to. They could just start trading it and use the HTS codes that are already internationally used for medical cannabis products and CBD. Now, if that's the case, then, you know, they would be subject to most favored nation and national treatment provisions in our international trade agreements, and USMCA included, meaning you would have to treat, one country would have to treat the products of another country the same as they treat their own products, to prevent discrimination amongst the countries. And you would have to, if you had a duty of a certain percentage for one country in the USMCA, you would have to provide the same treatment, the best treatment, to that other country as well. So, and it would probably be 0%, because that's the general drive in all these treaties, is to get to 0% tariffs. And so on we go. I mean, it becomes just another good internationally.
Is there,
Yeah, so I guess,
sorry to chime in there, is there a mechanism through the USMCA to set a standard for trade between Canada and Mexico and the United States?
In what sense? What standards?
Well, just kind of like setting a precedent to allow trade to go back and forth. Like, is that the tool to kind of to pursue, like, through that agreement to kind of set the bar? So
the entire agreement is there to facilitate non-discriminatory trade between the two countries. And so, yes, it's the mechanism to do it. There's also provisions in certain chapters of the agreement that encourage international standards and complying with international standards to ensure that there's a smooth trade pathway, so there's not too many regulatory burdens between the countries. So yes, I mean, it would make sense that this instrument could be the way to, provide a smooth international trade of this product.
No, I think one of the things also, oh, I'm sorry. I think one of the things also from United States perspective is that, just from the policy discussions, I think that one of the concerns that's happened in terms of discussing the issue internationally is there's sort of there's sort of this idea that if we haven't dealt with this domestically from the United States perspective, why should we have to talk about some of the treaties internationally? And it's interesting because there's really a lot of treaty implications for what might happen if wherever the United States moves from a policy perspective. And there are some who have talked about it and have leveled some of those questions. I know that the state attorneys general, which generally, they have discussions on international trade, both in Canada and in Mexico, on these items, not marijuana specifically, but on cross-border collaboration, have raised some of these issues because at the state level, they've seen these things come up, so it's natural to be having those discussions. Where at the federal level, there really isn't the impetus at the executive branch level yet to make those types of moves without some type of congressional oversight or discussion around that issue with passage. So, I think that what we're going to continue to see is a hold in place process, unless there's prioritization from the executive or from the administration here to have those types of conversations. And we haven't really seen that yet. I'm hopeful that we will see that going forward because it's really come to the point where you can't not have that conversation, right? You've got the two countries around you that are doing it. And, I like to say that, when I was a kid and I played hide and go seek, if I closed my eyes, I thought I was hidden, right? And that's sort of the United States policy vis-a-vis international right now. And that's not really the case. And the United States can't really afford to have these discussions going on without some level of inclusion or foresight on how that's going to move forward. So, I think that the points that are raised on this panel around that are extremely valid. And I think that it's something that, we would hope that the US government and in our conversations, we would hope that they would look at this.
Yeah, and I mean, Michael, you would know this better than I, but when you look at the polls in the US, the majority of people are fine with legalization now. I mean, the tide has really turned on this, and that's an important piece. The other thing is, I think both the MORE Act and the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act would still allow states to keep it illegal if they wanted. It's just descheduling it federally. So, that also gives some states who are concerned for whatever reason some leeway. Politically, I would imagine that should help also with whatever momentum and progress that you're getting on those two acts. I mean, watching it from Canada's perspective, it's not just cannabis, it's every issue. Watching how difficult it is to get things done, and the horse trading back and forth is astonishing. And as you said up top, there are bigger priorities in the US right now, and it took them months to pass the infrastructure bill, and the progressives and the progressives and the Democratic Party are still not thrilled with the outcome, and so they'll be pushing for more on that. So, there's only so much political capital for each session, and there's huge issues right now to deal with in the US. Having said that, as you also said, there's a lot of momentum on this issue. There's a lot of acts in the hopper. Some have passed the House, then not the Senate, but everything is heading in one direction. So I agree that I think it's just a question of time before something passes. And maybe it's something more conservative initially, like the Safe Banking Act. Maybe it's something more comprehensive, like the MORE Act or the Senate version of the MORE Act. But at some point, something has got to pass.
I think incrementalism also is going to be the name of the game from a policy perspective. I mean, if you look at the infrastructure bill, the infrastructure has been talked about for years. I mean, it wasn't just, one of the things. And if you go around the United States, I mean, the infrastructure that is in the United States is old, aging, and it took till this moment in order to get it done. And that, I mean, it's by design that the American system kind of plods along the way that it does. And I think, cannabis is an issue from a political perspective. Nobody's going to win or lose an election just on the cannabis issue. And so I think the prioritization of the issue falls into that politics. It's not bad politics to support cannabis, in the United States. And in fact, it's a lot of ways not very controversial, and everybody's for it. But Congress remains and has always remained a lagging indicator of where the American public is on issues. I mean, we're still fighting bad drug policy that goes, that goes beyond what we might look at in terms of the commercialization of adult use cannabis, but also, from the medical side that we talked about before at the federal level. We talk about medical and international trade. What does that mean? I mean, does medical mean the state level medical markets? Does it mean the FDA approved products, which is currently the only way to look at it federally? So those items have not actually been adjudicated from a political perspective in the United States. It's going to take time. And I think that incrementalism from a policy perspective, we all looked at what happened in Canada too. And there's still some things to iron out in the Canadian market. And I will say this, as somebody who, I worked abroad, and I used to work for, I worked in London for a number of years, and I worked in the House of Commons. And I remember watching the parliamentary system kind of unfold in the British House of Commons, and then through the Labour Party. And the reality is, when you put these things internationally and you talk about international markets and what things are, we all put our hats on and we all come at them from what our country looks at, and there are our own sensibilities with how we deal with those policies. And I think that the United States is stuck in its own glorious framework. And it does work generally, but it's going to take, take time, the way that it takes other things, and it'll happen. It's going to take, a level approach to be able to make that happen. And the discussions like this will help facilitate that trade, I think.
Yeah, and I think, that's a great segue to start talking about the opportunities in Europe. We were talking also in the green room about breaking news that just came out of Germany and their new coalition government that's forming or advancing legalization of cannabis in that state in Europe. And this is on the heels of only a few weeks ago where Luxembourg became the first in Europe to legalize growing and using cannabis. So, if the legalization process continues as expected, in addition to those countries, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and Germany, and Malta may be on course to introduce legal access to adult use cannabis within the next few years. So what are you seeing? I'll put that out to all of you. What are you seeing as opportunities for the Canadian cannabis companies as things start to evolve in Europe? And how do they prepare now to capitalize on these opportunities if they haven't done so already? And then a follow on to you, Yasmin, is, with CETA in place or provisionally in place, what does that mean for Canadian companies, and is there an opportunity there? Who wants to start?
I
Michael,
can.
any thoughts on? Go ahead, Yasmin. No, you go ahead, Yasmin.
So, I come at this from a regulatory perspective. New open markets is always a great thing. I think in Europe, you're seeing sort of 2 or 3 schools of thought as to how to do this. One is being very prudent and cautious initially and sort of setting up pilot programs like you see in France, for example, where you have to apply as a supplier to be a supplier to supply for this pilot program and see how things go. The French government will collect data and then they'll move from there. In other countries, it's only legal medically for a particular product like Sativex. So those are countries that are open for medical cannabis, but it's not easy, I would say. It's not like open free trade. And then there are those more like the UK and Germany that are a bit more open, and they've taken a different approach where you need a prescription for medical cannabis and you go and get it at a pharmacy. So I would say that category of country is a little bit more open and easier to access for companies in Canada or elsewhere outside of the EU. So, there are opportunities, but Europeans, like Canadians, perhaps really like to regulate. And I think you have to figure out, where you want to put your resources, because for every new market, there are rules and regulations to navigate, which takes resources internally in your company, a lot of resources, and then they can change on a dime, actually. So, there are great opportunities out there, but you have to really know what you're getting yourself into and whether it's worth going into a particular market based on how much time and resources is going to take to get in there. And as I said, some of the more heavily regulated ones maybe would be more difficult at this point than ones like the UK, which are a bit more open, like Germany. So great opportunities, but know what you're getting into. But that's par for the course in this industry, as we all know. And with respect to CETA, I mean, it's another tool, of course, to trade with zero duties or very low duties in an area, and it's similar to the USMCA or even the WTO agreements. It can facilitate non-discriminatory trade between countries. So it would be another tool for Canada to utilize to crack into the European market.
Yeah, I think in general, the European markets, from a regulatory perspective, are tough to navigate in general. Especially with how they treat products, and also how they just generally operate. And this is not necessarily even just a function of cannabis regulation. I mean, I've seen other products trying to get to market in the European Union, and the roadblocks are really tough. I mean, we have things that are available in the United States, and FDA is getting stuff through the FDA is no cakewalk for sure. And a lot of the things that the FDA gets approved, or how product distinctions are made with FDA, actually have global ramifications, because a lot of countries, if FDA has adopted something, they know that they've gone through sort of the rigors of that process. And in the European Union, I mean, there's still a number of products that generally Americans would hold as have gone through the proper safety protocols, that even in the European Union have not necessarily been adopted yet with some of the research. I mean, I can show that, and I don't think that's just that's just the cannabis industry in general. It just has to do with the regulatory frameworks that are there. But here's the thing: the European market presents such a massive opportunity that if you're investing in the space, the proverbial juice is worth the squeeze to people who are well capitalized and are able to navigate that. Just because something has a high level of regulation doesn't mean that it doesn't have a high level of reward for coming out of it. I mean, the regulation also acts to some extent as a barrier or a moat if you're able to work through it, and you're able to advantage the uncertainty in that. We see that in the United States all the time in the cannabis markets. Early on, we didn't have big cannabis marijuana companies. I remember when the market started, and I've been involved in this for about 7 years, right from the beginning. I mean, the big companies that we talk about now that are billion-dollar, several billion-dollar market cap companies were really just slide decks, 5 or 6 years ago. Right now, we're talking about 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 employees that I'm seeing in the same companies that are still there with M&A. And so I think that those barriers are not going to be a hindrance for everybody. It may hinder some of the market participation that we would naturally want to see evolve in that. But I think that for those who are involved in here, it may create some level of opportunity.
Yeah, and certainly the momentum created by the decisions made by certain states and certain jurisdictions will motivate others to do so, especially as they start talking about things like, minimizing the criminal element, which is a huge motivation of Luxembourg's decision, and looking for new generation of economic wealth and prosperity. So I think you're right. It will happen. It'll take time, and if you think things move slowly in the US, you should see what it's like in the machinery of the Brussels bubble. Let's turn over. There's a bunch of questions coming in from the audience. So this question is for you, Christian. What are your thoughts on cannabis as an agricultural commodity, and how it may factor into trade negotiations between Canada and other countries?
Well, I think, there's definitely a lot of opportunity to have cannabis as a commodity. I mean, we see lots of growth here. I think, there's some hurdles, black market being one of them. Some of the issues in Canada where, there's a glutton of supply. We always hear that everywhere. I think some of the reasonings behind that is quality, at least quality compared to the black market. So there's been improvements with that. So I think, if we can face some of those issues, I think there's great opportunity to, have the exchange and, have cannabis as a commodity.
Okay, thank you. Yasmin, another question that's come in for you. You referenced somewhat of a vague definition of medical cannabis and how it is not applied in the same way across the board. What's your opinion on what's needed in terms of adding clarity?
Right. So in Canada, for example, and I know something similar is being pushed by certain lobby groups in the United States, we need some kind of third category. So in Canada, there's discussion of something called cannabis health products. And the Health Canada folks have been trying to figure out what that standard will be by setting up a scientific board committee to figure out what kind of evidence will be required to meet this standard and get this seal of approval for a cannabis health product. They've been very slow, unfortunately, on this, and I'm not sure where they're at. I know they set up the scientific board, and hopefully things will move more quickly now that that's being done, because that's the sort of, I think, category that would fill that empty space that is now in the middle between pharma and rec. In the US, they're talking about something similar, as I said. I know the NCIA, for example, has done some work in this area, pitching government for this other category or two. And then it would be really up to whether or not international bodies like the WHO accept that other standard as fitting within the word medical under the international drug treaties. But right now we have nothing. So we need some kind of label and standard to fill this gap. And I know countries are moving towards it, but it's slow. And part of the reason they're slow is not the government's fault, I should say. It's because there's not a lot of research and data, trial data on the effects of cannabis in certain situations for certain indications. And so another huge piece of this is ensuring that governments and companies are able to actually encourage and do the research required to convince governments that this is a safe product and that it can be used to treat certain types of diseases and conditions with certain types of dosing. So we're really just starting this, and there's a long way to go on it, but it will also feed into this notion of what exactly is a medical product short of a pharma product.
And so are there parallels or can there be comparisons made to what's happening, with naturopathic remedies and medicines, as they've been navigating all of their issues around regulation and acceptance?
I mean, I don't know a ton about what the evidence is required for a naturopathic product, but I mean, from a process perspective, it would make sense to me that you would need the same kind of process in place, and you have a standard that is set based on scientific study and evidence, and then it becomes its own category. So similar, but it's for obviously very different products.
Okay, thank you. And another question, what sort of investments from governments, even in jurisdictions where cannabis is not legalized, are needed to help cannabis business navigate markets? Anyone have any thoughts on that, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we've seen in the United States, we literally have only just started seeing some of those types of investments at the state level. I literally read about, probably about a month ago, there was sort of the first state grant that had happened, economic development grants that were used on a cannabis company in East Coast states. There's some that have been happened out in the West Coast. I mean, funding traditional economic development funds and availability of those funds to the cannabis industry, I think is important in the United States, even prior to some of the laws that we might see. And from an economic development, from diversity and inclusion, there are a lot of programs that we'd be able to tap into if that were the case. We're only just starting to see that come online. A lot of folks find it hard to stomach that maybe the cannabis industry needs that level of funding when they generally see cannabis as being a fairly they see it as being a fairly robust industry, maybe without understanding that like any other industry, cannabis has pitfalls in it. So that's been a harder conversation to have. So to get state level jurisdictions involved in that, or even studying funds to study some of the economic opportunity there, and opportunity studies, all of those things generally advance policy. And that would be where I'd hope to see markets internationally that haven't legalized yet spend funds to figure out the appropriateness and how to engage in those markets. And from the state level United States perspective, things that would move policy along quicker.
Okay, great. Yeah, and go ahead, Yasmin.
Sorry, Jackie. I mean, Michael alluded to this earlier about capital markets. I mean, one of the big obstacles here is that the Safe Banking Act hasn't passed. So legally, the banking industry can't really get involved with cannabis in the US, which is a huge hindrance, as you can imagine. And there's no safe harbor provisions in that act for capital markets, which many people are saying needs to happen as well. So, I mean, you can't sort of support an industry without capital, right? So they need to work that kink out. And then I'd say that from the government's perspective, at least in Canada, one of the big issues and hurdles we've been having in Canada is that the cannabis file has been seen solely through a public health framework and lens, and has not been seen as an economic industry that needs support and should be encouraged to become the thriving industry that it can be, and to some extent already is. So, we don't have people in ISED or which is industry, basically like Industry Canada, Michael, for your benefits. Treasury Board, a bunch of them aren't even involved with the cannabis file. And until they do that, they won't look at it from an economic perspective and won't maybe consider the kind of economic support that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Somewhat related to that, it was a comment and a follow-up question to what you were talking about in terms of the benefits of cannabis and making the case for medical cannabis. So good point, Yasmin. And how can industry and government work with industry to fund research into medical cannabis products? So more funding on the research side, and how do industry and government work together?
Well, I know that researchers and investigators have been corresponding quite heavily with the Government of Canada in order to ensure that the pathways to research in medical cannabis are made more are easier, because there's been some roadblocks thrown up. For example, in order to do clinical trials, you need GMP certification. But in Canada, we came up with something called GPP certification, which is not used anywhere else in the world, but is the general standard for clinical trials. So there was that and a few other issues. Researchers said you can't ask us to do medical research and then hamstring us by not allowing us to access any supply domestically. So there's certain things that the government can work with researchers and universities on to ensure that there's a smoother pathway. And of course, there's also grants under a variety of programs in Health Canada that can be accessed to actually do clinical trials, or at least subsidized clinical trials, because they're very expensive. So things are starting in Canada, and I know even in the US they're slow, because there's been supply issues in the US, with basically there being a monopoly at the University of Mississippi for many years with respect to what supply can be used for research. and government in the US finally just recently said, okay, the DEA will issue other licenses to a certain number of others to provide supply for the specific purposes of medical research in the US. So it's really being more open to the fact that we need to do clinical research and facilitating it. So government can certainly help in that way.
Okay, thank you. And another audience question. You've mentioned the example of Luxembourg and Germany as possible leaders towards potential legalization. Will we ever see an EU-wide legalization? I know from my perspective, being here, the cannabis is still, and its products are still classified as a Schedule 1 drug, and that's what the EU Commission certainly points to. And there isn't a whole lot of appetite for, you know, EU-wide legalization, certainly, and certainly, you know, at the state level, from a medical perspective, that still falls within the jurisdiction of each of the member states. But Michael, Christian, Yasmin, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that you'll see it at some point. I mean, it's the reality is that you're going to see you know, right now with kind of the framework and seeing where member states are and where the push is, and also reading the sort of the international tea leaves on this. Like, I do think that it's really a matter of time. It's obviously not going to be the first institution to go and do it, but I think as sort of dominoes fall and there's discussions amongst countries both in and outside the EU, there will be more discussion on it. I also think that the EU is much more sensitized to what market conditions are in other countries that maybe are not participants in the EU as potential trade partners. So the international argument amongst EU members is actually a lot more persuasive than the international argument would be in, say, Congress, for example, in the United States. So as markets liberalize, I think that the European Union is going to be more a part of that discussion to push forward from a market standpoint than less. And also, I think that the European Union is also trying to assert its relevance still amongst countries vis-a-vis that are in the European Union versus those that have either are not in the European Union. And so I think that that political atmosphere, there's always going to be a push and pull, especially in that body. So I anticipate that cannabis legalization will fall under that political rubric as well.
Yeah, and I think certainly Germany's decision to move forward, and they are a key influencing state in the EU, certainly helps that case. But you know, then you still have to balance the influence of OECD and the UN and others that the EU, certainly the Commission, looks towards. Okay, what is the next emerging segment of the sector that could help push the needle on this? You know, for example, cannabis tourism.
I continue to watch the investment. Like, I think One Capital Markets obviously will continue to drive the conversation. I think also investment in more traditional products that you might see more mainstream consumption, where like cannabis beverage right now is something that in the United States only makes up like a percentage point in the market. We've instituted a push on cannabis beverage regulation through our Cannabis Beverage Council. There are a lot of companies that are heavily investing in that. And I know that the Canadian markets are also, you know, somewhat interested in products that might have a little bit more appeal beyond sort of the consumer that's in the market right now. So I think it's sort of, you see the destigmatization of the market, whether it be through product or whether it be through just the attitudes that have changed. So like, you have people who, yeah, maybe they're for legalization, but maybe it's not socialized enough for product usage. I mean, I look at people of my my parents' generation. And I think that there's sort of two. There were people who definitely consumed, and then there was sort of this split where, they look at the product and there's sort of a social stigma that's still attached to it. Whether they're for or against legalization doesn't really seem to matter. So the more that those things develop and we start to see that in market, the more the boundaries are going to be pushed for that development.
Yeah, certainly. And on the tourism side, I think anyone that's heard of Amsterdam will know that they've certainly made great hay about cannabis tourism. Okay, over to another question.
To chime
Go
in
ahead,
on that
Christian.
really
Sorry.
quickly too, like I think in Canada now you're seeing a lot of craft growers kind of partnering up with the more kind of established LPs, the larger LPs. And I think to your point with Amsterdam, like one of the things that was the draw was all the different strains you could try over there and everything. So I think that's kind of helping push the needle here now in Canada. I think having the craft guys enter, and I think if we can get more craft people to engage the market, get more micro people to engage, and there's already a framework for them to get their product out through some of the larger LPs that have a bigger reach across the country. I think that also plays a part.
Yeah, great point, Christian. Okay, so we are at the point where I have to ask each of you, I'm sure we could, there's many more questions to come. I'm sure we could carry on for hours more, but now I'm gonna ask each of you for 3 minutes closing remarks. And so Michael, why don't we start with you?
For sure. So again, thank you for having us here. And I appreciate the chamber engaging in what was a lively discussion today, and the fellow panelists here, and sort of envisioning what the next level of the cannabis market looks like and what the future holds. I think if we were to ask the audience, and from some of the questions that we heard today, there is a level of complexity, but also an understanding of some level of inevitability around cannabis policy and around the marketplace. A lot of that has to do with, I think, the positive trends that we see going forward in this industry, but also the market-based opportunities that are continued to develop on a case-by-case basis and on a country-by-country basis. And my view is that in the short term, some of the market turbulence that we've seen does present a potential opportunity for new businesses or established businesses to continue to move the market forward. And I would say to you, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and 7 years ago, I mean, this was all a different marketplace than what we're seeing right now. And the discussion and advocacy around a commercialized market is something that's important to the maturation of the market and to the industry as well. And so as we continue to look at things like capital markets going forward, whether it be products and branding, we talked a little bit about some of those products, whether they be, a cannabis beverage, or whether they be other ancillary products that enter the industry, or more mainstream research that we see from the medical field, and definitionally how trade is going to be developed around that. And research. I think that all of these areas present a very exciting and complex opportunity that people can actually take more advantage of now than they could several years ago. And those are opportunities that people here should continue to look forward to. So as we discuss international trade, and as the chamber considers it and as members consider it, I think all of these things have to be top of mind with how we can move this subject forward. And conversations like this, I think, end sort of the stigmatization that this segment has in other places of the market. And that's extremely important. We have to talk about cannabis like it is business, because it is. It is an important business. It is a large and growing business, and it's something that deserves and merits the attention of more mainstream establishment players and industries. So this forum, I think, is extremely important to that. And I just want to thank everyone else on the panel and the chamber for instituting this conversation.
Thank you, Michael. Christian, your final word.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for having me on the panel here. Yeah, I think maybe something to consider for some American companies going forward, just lessons learned from Canada, like I previously touched on, maybe partnerships with some of the legacy craft brands to kind of keep the market interested, keep the end consumers motivated and, you know, considering products, but also going green. There's a lot of opportunity in the States to learn from mistakes in Canada in terms of creating efficiencies within the grow ops themselves, which will also help, you know, maximize profits for growers in the States. So yeah, essentially, I think, you know, some opportunities, some lessons to be learned from Canada. And yeah, I think a big one is just green initiatives, LED lighting, wastewater management, all those types of things can definitely help give growers and LPs down in the States a boost and an edge for sure. And that's what I got.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, that's an important point, your last one there. So thank you for that. And Yasmin, last but not least.
Well, thank you, Jackie, Nathan, and Christy in the Chamber for organizing this great panel, and my fellow panelists. Really wonderful speaking to you. And I agree with both of you that it's important conversations to keep going and sharing knowledge so that we can keep moving in the right direction with this industry that is so fast moving. I mean, as Michael said, it's amazing how, I mean, many people get frustrated in this industry, but if you actually think about it, it's moved extremely fast over the last few years. Things have opened up faster, I think, than any of us maybe ever thought could happen back when little Canada legalized. Huge market potential, which is perhaps why things are starting to move along so quickly, because, you know, money does talk. And also, you know, as people's attitudes have shifted radically as well, I think governments are feeling a little bit more comfortable with moving in the direction of legalization and the creation of various products. I think I would say, you know, we really do need more data, though. You know, we need to do more research, more analysis, not just on the medical research side, but on the economic side. So, for example, in Canada, you know, this is actually a huge industry that contributes, and Nathan would know this well because he did the statistical analysis. It contributes billions of dollars to our economy. It's a big industry, and with that kind of data, you can arm yourself as an industry to push for various government changes and policy changes. So I think we need more data, and we all know that, but we need to get on that. The second thing is, I would say governments need to really listen to the private sector and the people on the ground in the trenches, because they know what's going on. And with a new industry, that kind of knowledge is very important to inject into policy conversations, so the right kind of laws and regulations can be introduced and not hinder too much the growth of the industry. And similarly, I would really hope that we get ahead of, as governments and as international organizations, international standards in this area. So there are already international standards that some companies and countries are using. For example, with respect to testing and labs, we have the ISO standards that some countries are requiring. That makes it much easier for businesses to do business when they can test in their own country to an ISO lab and give it to someone in another country who accepts that ISO standard, so they don't have to retest their product. That's actually small, but actually huge, because these things add up. So using international standards and developing them when we don't have them, for example, in extraction and production of cannabis. So I think that's an area that we can really work on and ensure that trade is as smooth as possible. And, you know, maybe taking a page out of the pharmaceutical industry, where they have mutual recognition agreements, where if you don't use the exact same standard as another country, the country at least recognizes it as equivalent. So if you're not going to use an international standard, you're still going to allow the product in because you recognize Canada's standard as good as your own. So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, excellent points, Yasmin, and I totally agree with you on the standards and in particular the need for economic data. And in fact, Nathan mentioned the Canadian Chamber. We did a mission to the OECD through business at OECD, of which the Canadian Chamber is a representative. And one of our key asks was to initiate an economic research review into understanding the economic impact of the industry. So hopefully we can continue to push for that. Thank you to each of our panelists, Christian, Michael, and Yasmin. Clearly experts, and we could have spoken for hours. Great optimism and the opportunity. I think someone made the point that this has moved quickly and it will continue to do so. And I believe that as well. So I look forward to hearing the next discussion when this group comes back together and we talk about how the needle has moved even further. So with that, I thank you all and invite everybody in the audience to enjoy a one-on-one video or a health break. So I'll leave it there, and good night, everybody from Brussels.
Thank you.
Thank you.